I founded and run an organization called Tech NYC, which is a coalition of about 700 tech companies and investors here in New York, kind of engaging in public policy, primarily now at the state and local level. But I have a long history, and know some of you in the room, of kind of sitting at the intersection of tech and policy and politics. I was once an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so I also come at this from a real internet freedom. Jamie, I think we probably have some alignment there. You know, that's, and the people who I think came up with me in those worlds really, and maybe we were, I will be the first to admit, somewhat naive, but had this understanding that, you know, that this technology was going to engender like the purest form of democracy, right? And you were going to have people everywhere learning and talking in a way that we never before could. And that was that was the dream. And for those of us who really believe that, and I still largely do with some reservations, which we can dig into, obviously it's not so simple. But for those of us who really believe it, the tough part is that looking at what's gone wrong in many ways, the kind of almost inevitable conclusion is that some people suck, you know, and that is a really hard conclusion to come to, because these technologies are tools, and what you're undoing is uncovering really bad behavior. But so often we're focusing the regulation on, instead of trying to talk about the underlying behavior, we're talking about how to regulate the tools. Now, I think we need to do both. I also don't think there's any real debate in this country anymore that some of the platforms should or shouldn't be regulated. Like, there shall be regulation, it depends what kind. Let me give you one quick anecdote of something that's happening here locally to illustrate this point, and then I'll kind of get off my, well, I won't get off my soapbox, you'll hear more of it as this hour goes on. But at City Council right now, there's a pending piece of legislation that says every store and restaurant must accept cash, okay? And this is framed very importantly as a social justice issue. There are huge amounts of people who are unbanked in this country, and that's a real problem for a lot of reasons. I can talk about that for a long time, but let's just put that on one side. On the other side, there's actually real value in establishments going cashless if people have access to pay, you know, assuming you don't have the unbanked problem. And in fact, much of the world actually is cashless. You know, third world countries are cashless. A cashless experience is often better for consumers. It's often better for shop owners. You know, the data is very clear that robbers and theft go down. So, okay, now you've got the two sides of this. This is one of the hardest, this is a smaller issue. It's not the big stuff we've been talking about, but this is really hard. I actually don't know how to think about this. I don't know which is right or which is wrong. But the problem is, the underlying problem isn't an establishment going cashless, it's that huge percentages of Americans are unbanked. So like that we cannot pretend that by passing a cashless bill, we've fixed the unbanked problem. We haven't even touched the unbanked problem.
Well, that really has been a theme for the last 2 days, and that is, do we reform around the edges or do we blow the whole thing up in order to reach those people who have not yet been not yet engaged?
And in some ways, I feel very thankful to tech that it has kind of unearthed some of those problems.
So, Siva, you talk about how technology has been deified. We heard in the last panel that we should avoid having technology be the golden calf. You also say that has caused us to undermine kind of our stable beliefs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I prefer to be specific, right? I prefer not to talk about technology as a phenomenon or a cloud or a god, and too many people do, right? There is not one thing called technology. There's no unified field that is called technology, and when I take a piece of chalk and I write on a chalkboard in my classroom, I'm deploying a particular technology that has certain aspects. It encourages certain forms of expression. It discourages other forms of expression. That's true of all technologies. Particular technologies have biases built into them. All technologies amplify certain aspects of our behaviors and limit other aspects of our behaviors. And when we use them smartly, we use them in conjunction with as extensions of ourselves, as Frank and before him, Marshall McLuhan had pointed out. And that is what we have lost, because now we have been opting for immediate gratification in so many areas of our lives. We've been opting for technologies, specific technologies, that maximize convenience and efficiency over all other values. And I think that's our original sin. One of the things I say about Facebook, and again, I prefer to be specific about all this, is that Facebook was designed for a better species than ours. And I think this builds on what Julie was saying, right? We are terrible. We're terrible to each other. I have a golden retriever, much better species, right? They're lovely, right? We are not lovely to each other, right? We're not lovely to the people in our own homes. And with that recognition, first of all, it's one of those terrifying recognitions that makes us all want to like go home and hug people, or just hug people here, and that's great, right? And we need to. It is a multi-century process of addressing questions of justice and kindness and goodness, and that's why we have, people of faith and people of science working on these problems in their own ways. Nonetheless, in 2019, we're still terrible to each other. In 2004, when Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, we were terrible to each other. And yet, at no point did he build into his system a recognition that terrible things go on and that people do terrible things to each other, say terrible things to each other, exploit each other. And then he built into his system an internal method of exploitation on top of that. And it should be no surprise, right? Because it's not a flat panel of glass. Facebook chooses for us what and whom we interact with. It chooses for us at a distance, in a complex way, by milling through acres of data, years of our interactions, and a complex set of relationships going on among other people. But nonetheless, Facebook's ultimately governing our experience. That's really how we have to look at this, right? With three key aspects about Facebook that you should take away from here. Number one, it's scale. 2.3 billion people. There has never been anything in human history that touched 2.3 billion people, except oxygen and water, right? It goes oxygen, water, Facebook, right? 2.3 billion people. That's stunning, right? That's a whole lot of zeros, and please keep that in mind. Anytime you think about responses, policies, reforms to Facebook, whatever you think of has to matter to a good portion of that 2.3 billion people, and we have never had a challenge like that. Those 2.3 people are conversing in more than 100 languages. Again, that's a whole new level of exponential challenge, right? The third thing we have to remember is the process of algorithmic amplification. That Facebook chooses to amplify the things that it has predicted will generate the strongest and broadest response in the form of shares, likes, comments, emojis, right? And anything that does that is going to kick around Facebook really strongly. Those things are going to be extreme. They're going to be crazy. They're going to be wacky. They're going to be funny, sometimes lovely, sometimes cute. They're going to be baby pictures and puppy pictures, but there's going to be hate speech. There's going to be calls to genocide. There's going to be harassment. There's going to be general nonsense, conspiracy theories, doubts about vaccinations, denial that the earth is round. That stuff flies around Facebook. Why? Not that a whole lot of people believe it. If I were to post on Facebook this afternoon that I think the earth is flat, and I link to some webpage, and there are a lot of them trying to show you the earth is flat, I would get hundreds of comments from my friends saying, what are you talking about? You're crazy. You really need to learn. Or if I did the same thing about vaccines, right? And whatever I posted would end up being one of the most shared things on Facebook. It would show up on thousands of people's sites. Why? Because all those people argued with me. You cannot argue with the crazy on Facebook because you amplify the crazy. It's through the looking glass. We have been trained and raised to challenge nonsense in our daily lives, but to challenge nonsense in Facebook is to see it blow back.
Frank, you were on the journalistic end of that, both when you went to the New Republic, and particularly after you got the new owner. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant from your standpoint as an editor in terms of the amplification and how it drove your work?
Well, I think Facebook is it's a machine that's based on manipulation, right? That you're supposed to inject things into the system, and so of course, bad actors, as we call them, would jump in to exploit that system because good actors are exploiting the system. And the thing I think it's so hard for people to comprehend about the ways that the Russians and others were exploiting Facebook is that they weren't walking in and bastardizing the system. They were using it in precisely the way that it was designed. And their stuff only traveled so far because the rules that Facebook had set, the rhythms of its news feed, the data suggests that certain things float to the top, and the bad actors came in and they supplied the system with precisely the things that the system appreciates. And I think it's pretty terrible that as we've grown dependent on Facebook for revenue and traffic, we end up becoming something other than the self that we set out to become. That instead of adhering to our own values and assigning the pieces that we know to be the right ones to assign, or thinking about our audience in a way where we're thinking about elevating our audience or we end up thinking about how can we serve the platform. And so, as I said before, the values of the platform end up becoming our values, and they end up taking us away. And one of the ways in which it takes media away from itself is that I think inherent in kind of the ideals of media that arose in the kind of early 20th century, where media transitioned from being hyper-partisan and ideas of objectivity, as flawed as those ideas are, started to take hold within the profession. There were certain ideals about the values that journalism was meant to practice, and those ideals have unraveled for a whole lot of reasons over the course. But one of the primary ones is just the economics of the system and the heightened place of these handful of platform monopolies have distorted everything.
Well, Jamie, can you hear me?
He can hear you.
Oh, okay. One of the things I want to ask all of you is solutions. And one of the things that Frank has suggested is a data protection authority. How would that work? And then I'd like Jamie to react to that kind of intrusion.
Well, I actually don't. I think what I was proposing is not such a novel thing because it exists in Europe and in many other countries around the world. It's just it is gobsmacking that when you look at privacy regulations, we have it as it relates to health information or certain parts of financial information. But I think with tech, part of the problem is that we created this thing, and especially in this country, we assumed that it was something different, and so we suspended a lot of our traditions, our way of thinking, and so we created a system that had no constraints. There are no speed limits, there are no safety belts, there are none of the things that we've imposed on other systems as they've emerged. And so I think it's only actually a matter, this is the thing that's going to happen the fastest, because we had California passed a privacy law last year. I think it's a pretty skeletal law. I think that the tech companies are only too happy to see those types of skeletal laws emerge. The tech companies are going to race to try to create something similar in Washington that they can get behind and that will exist on their own terms. Meanwhile, you'll have other state governments that will be with entrepreneurial governors who want to get out ahead of the system, who will try to outbid California, and that's the thing that the tech companies ultimately want to try to preempt.
I'll come to you, Julie, in just a minute. Jamie, what's your view of the next steps in terms of regulation in getting to the world that you envision?
I think there is a menu of, forgive me. I think there is a menu of options, and in a sense it depends on which problem you're trying to tackle at any given time. One, which I know Franklin has thought a lot about, is a structural approach to regulation. That is to say that the problem with a lot of these firms is their size, and they should therefore be broken up. I support that kind of regulation, but I don't think that our existing competition law, as we call it here in Europe, or antitrust law, as it's called over there in the States, is well equipped to deal with the problems that are thrown up by tech firms. The reason I say that is that traditionally competition and antitrust law are designed to counter abuses of economic power, so things like price discrimination or predatory pricing. But in economic terms, what we get from technology is often not that exploitative. I know there are people who will disagree with me, but in financial terms, the value to me of my data that I give to Google in exchange for the wonderful services that I get from it, a portal into a world of knowledge that I would never otherwise have, the actual financial value that I would get if I sold that data is very, very small. And so I don't say that what's happening with Google, the problem with Google is that it's economically exploiting me. And I trained as a competition lawyer, and it seems to me that a lot of our laws and a lot of our precedents are geared towards economic exploitation, whereas the real problem with technology is that they abuse a different kind of power, which is political power, the ability to get us to do things we wouldn't otherwise do, to believe things we wouldn't otherwise believe, the ability to distribute resources around a market system. So I propose a sort of a new type of antitrust law with a new separation of powers, where along a number of different vectors, technology companies should never be able to acquire a particular number or a particular extent of power functions through the technologies that they own and control. That, to answer your earlier question, is an entirely new form of regulation that barely exists, and we're not very close to implementing it. That's just one menu. That's one item on the menu. There's plenty of us, myself included, who say that technology companies should be made more transparent. The political principle here is that if you wield great power, then the ways in which that power is wielded should be made as obvious as possible to the people over whom it is wielded, which is why we ask our legislators to deliberate in public and post their laws in public. There are obvious problems with asking algorithms to be transparent and in asking companies to reveal commercially sensitive data, but really we're not even on the field when it comes to transparency. And we shouldn't have to wait for Jack Dorsey, the head of Twitter, to come to Congress and tell us, out of his goodwill, that the Twitter algorithm inadvertently downgraded 600,000 accounts, including those of some prominent politicians around about election time, with potentially affecting the outcome of those elections. We shouldn't have to rely on Jack Dorsey to tell us that out of his own goodwill. I think if you wield a form of power as potent as the one that Twitter does to impact the democratic process, the system should be in place at a much earlier stage for civic-minded individuals to keep track when things are going wrong. Obviously, a third form of regulation is data regulation, which is significantly more advanced in Europe than it is in North America. The General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, is a long and extremely boring piece of legislation to read, but it's quite profound in what it does. It limits any firm or any institution. It places limits on what they can, how much, the kind of data they can gather, the circumstances under which they store that data, and the circumstances under which they can transfer that data to a third party. Now, critics of that system, from the North American perspective, would say it is that approach to data protection that has meant that Europe has never produced a Google or a Facebook, because it's very difficult when the laws on data protection are so stringent to do that. That may well be the case. I think the question we have to ask is whether it's a sacrifice that we are willing to make.
Let me go to.
I think the national bodies have more power at their disposal to tackle individual problems, like the problem, for example, posed by political chatbots or extreme hate speech on social media, than people think they do. You know, if you use Twitter in Germany, you won't see a swastika because the German government told Twitter to make sure that no one saw swastikas because that symbol is illegal in that country. It's not the same here in the UK, and I don't think it's the same. It's definitely not the same in the United States. So options. I haven't even spoken about the idea of creating a profession for people who work in the industry with self-regulating
Let me-
standards and codes of conduct and ethics. There's loads of other different approaches. I hope that we can have a vibrant public policy debate in the years to come about it, which embraces the structural, the transparency, the data protection approaches that many others besides.
We're seeing the limits of technology here too. Thank you for that. Julie, I know you want to respond, representing the tech industry on the panel.
Let me start again. I said this earlier. I'm going to repeat myself. These companies can, should, and actually already are being regulated. I mean, I think we can start from that baseline. No one reasonable is pretending that regulation shouldn't happen. And to the extent that it is, and I think it should, I think that though there are some countervailing things I would just bring up that should be part of the conversation. Number one, we've lived in an amazing time. We are living in a truly amazing, transformative time that has upsides and downsides and is really like truly unique. Now, one of the things that's been amazing about it is that power structures are totally fundamentally shifting in ways that are, Frank, you talked a lot about that. Some are good, some are bad. It's really quite difficult to get your head around. That is going to inevitably, that window will close. And we will bake in new, if we haven't already, we will bake in new kind of primary players and new winners and new losers. My instinct, as I think about this, is that as we regulate, we should also ensure that we are still surfacing good ideas, good people that should be part of the debate. We need to be incredibly careful, and especially when you're talking about internet-based businesses. For those of you, borders, this all sounds so trite. Borders don't mean anything to the internet. And if you are a smaller startup who's dealing with the California law, and all of a sudden you're dealing with 10, 15, 25, 45 state privacy laws, who can afford to deal with that is Google and Facebook and Twitter and whoever. Do you know who can afford to deal with that are the smaller competitors. And now the market is not perfect, and I'm not saying that that's where we should be, but that is something that I absolutely think we need to keep in mind as we talk about regulation. I also, and this is part of why I'm so bullish on New York, by the way, as opposed to our friends on other coasts. There was this moment in time, the past 20, 15, 10 years, where these companies, who quite frankly for a very long time no one took seriously, regulators didn't take them seriously, competitors didn't take them seriously, in many ways the market was even slow to take them seriously, they exploded. And they did it oftentimes in office parks. They did it, in a bubble, or a vacuum, I should say. I think where people weren't really paying attention. Well, those days are over. You don't see a new business model that doesn't get the attention of regulators anymore. We, if anything, pay attention too early. The pendulum will swing, and it should, but I think that we need to be careful about the unintended consequences of going too far and too fast as well. Why I think New York, by the way, is really well positioned to navigate that is because I believe that the entrepreneurs here, the founders here, they're in New York and places like New York, you can't avoid other people. You can't avoid other ideas. You bump in, I moved here from San Francisco when I was pregnant with my first kid because I wanted to raise a child here, and sure enough, he's now in school, and my husband and I are the only parents who work in tech in his class. That is by design. That is the experience I wanted to live. That's the experience I wanted my children to live. That's the experience that every tech company founder in New York lives by virtue of being in New York.
So I've been told we should go to questions, and then I'm going to ask all of the panelists to give us a final word. I have asked them to think in terms of one thing that they could challenge each of you to do that would lead us toward a better world in terms of democracy and technology, okay? So, questions from the floor. Yes, in the back there.
Would it be helpful to abolish the anonymity of the internet?
I wouldn't know how to do that. Well, first of all, anonymity is a rare thing in practice, right? You actually, to be anonymous through digital networks, you pretty much have to use strong encryption, and very few people have the patience or training to do that. Besides that, your identity is pretty much known, as is your location, your favorite hobbies, the kind of pornography you like. That's all pretty much well known. Like, anonymity is the least of our problems at this point.
Any of you have another comment on that?
I can speak loudly. So a follow-up to question to this is, would it be helpful to actually increase the visibility of that data identifying yourself on the networks? Because it may create new self-censoring
Right.
barriers or new...
Well, that increasing the visibility of personal data increases the vulnerability of those who are most vulnerable, right? So we have so many nested challenges and nested problems, and one of the problems is that for a significant number, maybe even the majority of people who necessarily interact with each other through digital systems, there are significant exposures to vulnerability, harassment, threats, tracking, stalking, discrimination, right through to genocide.
Slight difference is visibility of your own data to yourself,
Ah,
not necessarily to the general public.
okay. Yes, except that puts the burden on the user. That puts the burden on the user to understand and comprehend how that data is being used, right? So an important aspect of the GDPR in Europe is that you can request from these companies everything they know about you. And you get a tremendous amount of data. And if you have the spare time, if you have a job like mine, you can actually go through your files and figure out what they know and what they're doing with it. But that's a privilege I have and a handful of activists have, to spend that kind of time and money and even care. But for 99.99999% of people in Europe, there is no such luxury. So it doesn't actually address a problem at a macro sense. It does mean we can have a few horror stories about the data that people have pulled out.
Just to build on that, though, when you do open it up to researchers and to academics, you do end up, that can push for change. And so I think that while it might not actually put the tool in the hand of the everyday user, it does open us up to people who are thinking more broadly, including someone like you, and then that can have impact.
Okay.
I just want to. I think that the privacy debate is the place where I think that there's the greatest sense of fatalism, that we've already crossed thresholds and there's no reconstituting privacy. And I think that there's a failure broadly to appreciate what it is about privacy that we care about and why we want to defend it. And the question of intellectual surveillance, I think, is at the core of it. And Jamie talked about it in his opening talk, which is that when you are being watched, you cease to become yourself. That if you think that part of the way that we formulate our own ideas is that there's this mysterious conversation that happens inside of our brain where we're turning over subversive ideas and we try them on for size, we reject them. But part of formulating opinions, it means that ultimately you're going to have to, you should be turning over things that you don't want people to see you turning over. And I really hate the way in which this is not, this is a technology problem more broadly. As we move into these open office spaces where you're existing in kind of those panopticons, when chats at work are not things that happen face to face, but in Slack, in that there's this sense of performance. And I think that sense of performance is where we're kind of destined to head.
Frank, I think I'm far from a fatalist on privacy, or as I prefer to discuss it in these terms, data protection, because privacy actually means a whole other thing. I can get into it for half an hour if you want. But we have to have the problem properly diagnosed. The problem in 2019, in the 21st century, is not the panopticon. That is a problem. The problem is the cryptopticon. It's the systems of surveillance that we're not allowed to see or understand, right? So it is not the cameras that we can easily spot that might curb our edge behaviors, but it is the ways in which police officers, police systems have data on our individual behavior and our collective behaviors and have divvied up cities into grids of hot zones where they will sweep in whenever they know that there are a large number of young men gathering, right? That is a system that the subjects of that surveillance are not allowed to interrogate, are not allowed to understand. They're run by private companies that are not subject to freedom of information. The hidden versions of surveillance are where the dangers are and where the economic power is. And those are the ones, and that's true at a national security level, at a local police level. It's true at Target. It's true through Amazon. It's true through Facebook and Google. They do not want us to understand and to comprehend and to feel the full level of that surveillance. So if we are going to address these problems, as I think we not only should but can, we have to understand the pervasiveness, the depth, and the real scale of the threat, and it is awesome and terrifying.
I guess that's a very good question. And I also agree with Jamie's point about the way we approach technology in terms of being a skeptic. I guess my question to you, to the panel, is how can you guys provide some concrete examples of how regulation can occur in terms of like the technology company? For instance, you hear stories about how, for example, judges are using technology to kind of predict the likelihood someone will commit the crime again, et cetera, and there's biases that exist where this technology is predicting that a person of color is more likely to commit X and Y crime compared to someone who's not a minority. So I guess my question is, what are some of the concrete regulation that can occur, not in just terms of, in terms of the holding the companies or those who are creating these algorithms responsible, making sure that these biases don't affect the algorithm that's being created?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We haven't actually talked that much about the algorithm and AI and the bias and data sets that kind of leads to that situation that you're talking about. New York City, actually, and Chicago as well, are both doing something on this right now at the very early stages. New York City has, by law, put together a task force out of the mayor's office. I sit on that task force where we're figuring out essentially how the city can and should be using algorithms for that very reason, and trying to set up some recommendations. Chicago and New York are kind of like fighting to be first, which is funny. But I think that those questions are really hard, and I would go back to a point I made earlier that I think is really important. The reason you get those bad outcomes, the reason you end up at that square block that you're talking about or whatever, is because that's baked into the data. America, and much of the world, but let me talk about America for a second, has a horrible history of racism. And that is in the data. And what we do when we take the big data of hundreds of years of history and use that to train our algorithms, we are training our algorithms with racist data. And again, so like, are the algorithms racist? Like, whatever, I don't use your language, however you want to use it, it's important. But what is important, the most important to me, is that we also don't fail to look at the core of the problem. And so while we don't bake in the racist data, let's also like try harder to not be racist, and that's difficult. But I think, as far to answer your question directly, I don't know a good example yet of a jurisdiction regulating on the algorithm side of the house, but there are all other areas.
Well, there actually is motion on that specific question. I will give you one example that just happened today, that in a different part of life, going back to Facebook. Just today, the German data authorities have ruled that Facebook may not merge the back-end data produced by WhatsApp users and Instagram users with the data they have for Facebook users. This is a core part of Facebook's strategy over the next few years to try to fuse these different systems. So if you're going around, or your kids are going around saying, I don't use Facebook, I use Instagram, not for long, it doesn't matter. Facebook owns them all. All that data is going to be merged. All of it's going to be used to target ads and content in the same ways that it is on Facebook. But the German government said, wait a minute, let's not do it this way. You have to keep that data segregated. Facebook's going to appeal all the way through the EU process. This is one of the early challenges to this sort of regulation. It's going to take years to figure out what the actual terms of use are going to be for that company. But it's a very bold move on behalf of the German government, a very big start. So we do see some level of awareness. I would, however, question the use of the word solution. There are no solutions. Think about, again, the scale of the problem, 2.3 billion people in more than 100 languages. Think about the number and range of problems that, just to pick on Facebook, because I wrote a book about it, have created, right? We have problems of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, calls for genocide, whatever you want to call it. I tend to call it garbage, right? You have a garbage problem. You have a surveillance problem. You have a manipulation problem, a behavioral manipulation problem. You have a political power problem because Facebook has so much political power. By the way, Facebook owns your senior senator if you live in New York. Chuck Schumer is the largest recipient of money from Facebook. He is very good friends with Sheryl Sandberg, and his daughter works at Facebook. So we will not see any strong regulation come out through the U.S. Senate anytime soon, as long as Chuck Schumer's in office. So, and goodbye to U.S. legislation.
I've been told-
Take it up with him, by the way. Call him if you have a chance. It's not going to matter. My senator and him, they're at odds over Facebook. But okay, but we do have responses, right? So Jamie talked about competition law, and he's right. It has to transform to be effective, and we should, on both sides of the Atlantic, work on this. We should be talking about whatever limitations we can put on garbage, but in this country, basically that's zero. The First Amendment stops any meaningful regulation of garbage. And we should be worried about data protection, which we don't really have a chance as long as Chuck Schumer's in office. But putting all that aside, let's think of, though, where it really matters.
I don't think that's fair to Chuck. I have to quickly.
No, it is totally fair to him. He is completely
also,
bought
it's
by
really,
Facebook.
his daughter, who I know, I don't know if it's entirely fair to bring the fact that she works there into it. You can bring some of the other things into it where the money went, but I really, Chuck has
I'm
been
gonna
really.
keep us back on track.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
All right.
keep
I feel like I
us
have
on
to
track.
just.
One
sorry.
more point from Siva, and then Jamie,
All right.
we're going to ask you to wrap it up with a challenge to the audience.
I just want us to get our heads out of North America and Western Europe for a second. There are 220 million Facebook users in the United States. That's 69% of the United States. There are 250 million Facebook users in India. That's only a quarter of the population, and it's growing at a much faster rate in India, in the world's largest democracy, which has an election this year, which operates in more than a dozen languages. So all of these problems that you see with Facebook that you think have messed with America, we got off easy. Wait till you see what happens in India later this year with that election.
Hey, Jamie, you have the last word. No? We don't have Jamie. Do we have Jamie?
Can you hear me now? Technology.
Last word to you, Jamie.
Well, my last word is that I think. Sorry. My last word is this: the problems that we are talking about today, or rather than challenges, come alongside a host of extraordinary opportunities and remarkable developments in humankind, which I think we're privileged and lucky to live through. My take on it is that I think we too often jump to the end of the intellectual argument. We ask about regulation and laws and even about personal conduct. Whereas I think that particularly in the academy, but also in public discourse, we don't talk enough about the underlying principles that should govern our thinking about this sort of stuff. You know, what is it precisely about the fact that when you type the word "why do Jews" into Google, it offers you the autocorrect "have big noses"? What is it precisely about that that offends us or that is wrong? And only once you have an answer to that can you ask, what would put an end to that? And what would we sacrifice by doing that as well, in terms of our free speech or in terms of our understanding of what other people are typing into Google at the same time? jump straight to asking what the law should be or what the regulation should be, you miss the deeper questions that matter about what we're actually trying to achieve as a society. And once we have, if not an agreed set of goals, but at least an agreed set of arguments about what the goals should be with particular technologies, only then can we move safely, I think, to a stage in which we're in a position to make sure that technologies are our servants and not our masters.
That's a great way to close. Let's thank our panelists. And you have a 5-minute break. You need to be back at 2:45 because we have panelists with a deadline.